Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all in one of the Naseej Academy webinars. Today, if we are in our region, it will be tonight on the other side of the ocean. So this morning, we will have two guests that related to our topic. This topic, I think, very important in this time, especially with the corona and lockdown and this time, because we are talking about managing something very special in our life, managing knowledge. Knowledge, this is essential for organization to be learning organization, knowledge which is very essential for everybody in his career, in his work. So what we need to talk about it is something very important because it's related to the human mind. We have the C drive, we have the A drive, but we have to think about the B drive, brain drive, all the knowledge that we have it in our mind. I think this is the time, this is the right time to think about it, how to capture it, how to maintain it, how to reuse it, how to capture it for the organization. Many organizations, I think, facing a problem related to there is many experts they have, and those experts, for some reason, left the organization to another one, or maybe left their position to a higher position. So they move with their knowledge, and the organization or the department they're working for lost this information or this knowledge, exactly as a term. So in this session, we will talk about how to manage this issue, how to manage the knowledge that we have through a methodological approach. The title for our webinar is Illuminate Your Organization, a knowledge management framework for knowledge sharing. And our guest that I am glad to introduce here is Professor Kendra Albright. She's a Goodyear Endowed Professor in Knowledge Management, School Information, Kent State University. Also, she's the editor-in-chief for Libri, which is an international journal of libraries and information studies. She teaches different and many topics related to our topic in the webinar, like knowledge management, whether this subtopic like business intelligence or environmental scanning or information economics. Also, she studied and specific topic like understanding the use of information to facilitate positive change and solve organizational problems. The second or the other guest we have, Dr. William Bill Edgar, and he is knowledge management consultant. He's providing guidance for projects, and also he conducts research in organizational strategy, knowledge management, librarianship. He teaches many topics and courses like information science and knowledge management for graduate and postgraduate students in different universities. And I would like to leave the stage for them to start our webinar just right now. Please, Kendra and William, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for that very nice introduction, Dr. Mohammed. We are very excited and pleased to be here today. And I just thought I'd start off with a real brief story about when I was at the University of Sheffield and I was taking Arabic lessons. And I was just sharing this with Dr. Mohammed, who said, you might want to tell them this story. So I was taking Arabic lessons and I had two teachers. One was from Oman and the other one was from Syria. And they spent most of their time arguing over the pronunciation of the words that I actually learned very much. But I will say marhaba, and I hope that I said it with enough of a recognizable pronunciation that you can say that you know that I'm saying hello. And it's our very big pleasure to be here today. I'm Dr. Kendra Albright, and I'm here with my colleague and research partner, Dr. Bill Edgar. And we'd like to start today, if possible, just by asking you to type into the chat box your name, where you're joining us from, and the name of your institution, your organizational affiliation. So if you guys would just take a moment and type in your name and your institutions, where you're working and where you're from. I saw someone from Jordan and Libya. Oh my goodness, we have a lot of representation here. This is wonderful. And of course, I don't read Arabic very well. I see Dubai. I've been to Dubai. Yes, a beautiful city. Yes. And good evening to all of you. It is so nice. And there's somebody from Brooklyn. That's wonderful. Qatar and Cairo. Oh, it's wonderful. Botswana. This is amazing. We have quite the international group here. Lebanon, wonderful. So hello to some of you. Marhaba to some of you. So we are very happy to see all of you here. So thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to try to share my next slide if I can get it to advance. Ah, there we go. Maybe. All right. I'd also like to ask you guys a question now to put in the chat box, just a yes or a no. How many of you have been involved in a knowledge management project? Just say yes, you have been, or no, you have not. So yes or no. This is, yep. We have a lot of yeses and we have a lot of no's. So that's about what we expected. So for those of you with much experience, we hope that you will continue to learn by what we present today. And for those of you who have not been involved, we hope that we'll give you some good ideas about how to get engaged in knowledge management processes. Knowledge management, in our estimation, is based on 3 pillars of people, process, and technology. We include strategy as part of the process, so that's important to include as well. So we're going to talk about these 3 things today, and we're going to we hope to help you develop ways to create knowledge management solutions that work for an organization. But to do that, it's really necessary to understand current organizational practices, including their strategic goals. You have to make sure that you align all of the activities in a KM program with the strategic goals of the organization for whom you're working, as well as to understand their knowledge needs and their knowledge flows within the organization, as well as the use of technology to support those processes to facilitate knowledge sharing. So this workshop will really present you with a KM framework that you can use to guide your knowledge management practices, to help you focus on the knowledge cycle and knowledge sharing, as well as the project phases of a KM process, which would be initiation, discovery, design, and implementation. So we'll also look at knowledge sharing and benefit reward systems for knowledge workers within the organization. And then finally, we'll take a quick look at a case study that demonstrates the effectiveness and value of KM in organizations. Now, I suspect that quite a few of you have seen this idea before of the knowledge pyramid, if you will. But before we start, I just want to talk about this pyramid in terms of what is knowledge. So here we see the data is at the bottom of the pyramid, which really refers to discrete objective facts about events. That information then is data that then makes a difference. It has some kind of meaning attached to it. So the interrelationships among data, information, and then knowledge are hierarchical, where data represents that elementary and crude form of existence of information, where information then represents data that has been endowed with some kind of meaning, and knowledge represents information that has also included experience, insight, and expertise. So the outcome at the top is that knowledge is information that has been turned into actionable intelligence, such as decision making. So you can look at the pyramid there and see that as you go up the pyramid, you're getting narrower and narrower as you turn that data to information and information into knowledge. So it also coincides with the processes there of the KM cycle, which are collecting the information, organizing, analyzing it, applying it, and ultimately making decisions. It also encompasses the use, over on the right here, the tacit and explicit forms of knowledge that we're going to talk about next. So as you can see, we're using the analogy of an iceberg, that the top of the iceberg is what you can see, but below the top of the iceberg is what's underneath the water, which it can be much, much larger. So that when we say you're seeing the tip of the iceberg, there may be a whole lot more underneath it. And so the tacit knowledge is that which is below the surface, that which we can't see quite so easily. Therefore, explicit knowledge is really knowledge that you can be more formalized, that you can articulate it, that you can store it, you can codify it, you can access it, and therefore it's very much easier to share with other people. Tacit knowledge is a whole different thing. That's knowledge that is very difficult to express. It's knowledge that we keep in our gut. It's gut feelings, our intuition. We somehow just feel that it's this way. We believe it's this way, and it's very hard to explain why. And that makes it much more difficult to not only identify and express it, but also then to be able to share it with others so that they can use that knowledge and take advantage of that and use it to the best advantage of the organization. So some examples here include personal wisdom, experience, insight, and intuition. But the object is to try to take as much of, to capture that tacit knowledge and turn it into explicit knowledge as much as you possibly can. And there are ways and techniques that you can do that through knowledge acquisition and analyzing the outcome of those discussions with experts about why and how. There's a lot of different ways. I worked in expert system development about 20 or 30 years ago, and that was what we did, was knowledge acquisition with experts who were getting to retire, to capture that tacit knowledge of what made them good at their jobs so that the new people could come in and learn from that if we could capture that knowledge and codify it in ways that could become more usable. Before you start on any KM project, here are some 10 questions for you. It's just a checklist to think about. These are things just for you to think about when you're getting ready to start. There was a study that was done by McKinsey that shows that workers spend quite a bit of their work week just looking for internal information or tracking down colleagues who can help with specific tasks. So as you're going through this list of questions, do you have a clear vision for KM? There's many things that you need to know, both tacit as well as explicit. For example, the clear vision of KM can come from understanding more about what the strategic goals of the organization are, but you also need to understand how their operational processes help to support that strategic goals, because sometimes that'll help define whether or not that will have a successful outcome. And then you need to align your plans to match those. So sometimes you'll have strategic plans. That can be a very good form of explicit codified knowledge that you can understand. But some of these things you may need to find the expert who has the tacit knowledge to help you understand the depth of knowledge that you know in order to best help the organization better position itself. So for example, do you know who knows what and who are the experts? So that's a good question to find out before you really launch any particular KM program. So now we're going to look at some definitions of KM. I just picked out 4 here that I thought you could just kind of glance over. When I look at these, there are some that make more sense to me than others. One of the earliest definitions was by Davenport there at the top, the process of capturing, distributing, and effectively using knowledge. That's a very nice, simple definition, but it implies a lot of complexity that, as you can see as you go down, there are more and more complex definitions. This second one here, I wanted to include particularly because I disagree with this definition. It's referring to knowledge management as the conscious management of a key corporate asset, knowledge, for the purpose of advancing organizational learning, strengthening the organization's ability to sustain and advance its core competencies, and securing competitive advantage. It's cutting edge research right now is coming out of Harvard with the work of Jennifer Lerner, and at Emory University, the work of Drew Weston, who have both come to the similar conclusion that about 95% of our decision making is made outside of our conscious awareness, that we don't always understand those gut feelings of what leads us to make a decision. So they're not necessarily conscious, and that's a very important point to identify here, because this is where a lot of our research is going to be going in the future, is drawing from what is our understanding of how decisions get made. So decision making from both a business perspective and a psychological perspective that will have an impact on the organization is important to understand. One of the things that Jennifer Lerner has understood, has identified, is that emotions have a huge impact on our decision making, some in very constructive ways and some in not so constructive ways. That's probably no surprise, but what she's finding is that CEOs of large companies often have a fairly high degree of anger, but they've learned to channel that into constructive action that benefits the organization. It also probably explains a certain degree of leadership, and this is where some of the psychological tests like the big Neo 5, I can't even remember what they all are off the top of my head, but they're personality tests that understand some of the depths of what underlie in our, for lack of a better word, our soft underbellies that help us make those non-conscious decisions that ultimately determine what the outcome of a decision might be. So I think that's a really important point just to make about where the cutting edge research is coming in KM in terms of decision making and what drives people probably in terms of knowledge sharing as well. But to pull it back now to KM a little bit more specifically, Milton and Lamb came out with a very nice textbook in 2020, and they summarize, I think, a lot of what's in these definitions. They say that the priorities of knowledge management include connecting people through communities and networks. So people is at the core. People are at the core. Improved access to documents, including search and portals, so that you can make information formalized as much as possible, and so it's easily shared across those communities. Knowledge retention, as we've just talked about. Learning from experience and capturing that knowledge. Creation and provision of best practices, innovation, and the provision of knowledge to customer-facing staff. So again, all of these things are leading to people being at the core of KM processes, which is well demonstrated here in this particular slide, where we have 3 pillars of KM, as I said: process, people, and technology. And I always point out that strategy is also included in that process. But these estimates are not mine. These are estimates from the literature that suggest that 70% of KM is about the people. So people are at the center of KM. And if you think about what that means, what we're talking about there are stakeholder attitudes, motivation, innovation, communities of practice, teamwork, tacit and explicit knowledge, knowledge sharing practices, not to forget change management. And I want to make a quick note about change management because Jean-Claude Monet, who is the former head of KM at Microsoft and who's on our KM advisory board at Kent State for our KM program, he made the comment that you can't change an organization. An organization is an inanimate object. You cannot change an organization. You have to change the people in order to make changes happen within an organization. And so it's important to recognize the importance of people in that process of change management. So you need to focus change management not at an organizational level, but more about organizational goals and how you motivate and incentivize people to make the changes that will move the organization forward. Process here has to do not only with strategy, but also with the KM cycle itself, which we'll talk about in a minute. It also includes workflows, best practices, and now standards. We have an ISO standard for KM, which I'm not sure how many people really fully understand, but we do have Patricia Eng on our advisory board also, who is one of the few people who teaches the class on how to interpret the ISO standards and is very conversant in that. And then finally, technology. Technology is designed to support people and processes, and that can include things like data storage, data mining, networks, decision tools, as well as communication. It can be designed to help facilitate and surround the needs that people have within the organization. And one thing I will point out, as an information scientist of sorts, it's my clear understanding after so many years of working in this field that we do not want to create technologies that people have to learn to adapt to. We want to develop technologies that solve the problems that people have within any organization. So rather than people bending to the technology, we need to make sure we understand what is needed and then match the right technology to the needs instead of forcing people to try to use something that already exists that may not answer and solve their problems. All right, and with that, I would like to lead us now into the KM cycle and turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Bill Edgar. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kendra. First, I'd like to talk, as she said, a little bit about what has been called the KM cycle. There are different versions of this, so this is just one version among a number that exist. And the idea of the KM cycle is that there are activities that are done by people within organizations and they do these activities upon knowledge or engaged with knowledge, right? And so as they do these activities, more often than not, these activities repeat themselves. And sometimes they do so in such a way that the cycle is linear. So you'll have activity A, then B, then C, then D. Sometimes it's not linear. Sometimes you'll have activity A, then C, then B, then D, then A. Either way, it's still cyclical. And this is just one example of a depiction of the KM cycle. So according to this example, you could say that activities are done upon knowledge first so as to learn it. That's depicted on the left. Once it's learned or as it's learned, it's shared throughout an organization. That sharing leads to two different things, usually simultaneously. It leads to some kind of innovation, some kind of change in the organization, and it leads to, at the same time, some kind of reuse of this knowledge, usually in ongoing organizational processes, which we will talk about in a little bit. This overall leads to and provides a basis for collaboration, and that leads back to more learning, provides the basis for more learning. And as this is done, people and processes and technologies are all supported integratively. So again, this is just one model, one way of depicting this ongoing KM cycle. Next slide. The next thing that I think we need to think about is that however we do the activities, and we'll talk about those in a minute, however they happen in terms of a cycle, the most direct thing that KM activities do is to support organizational processes. They enhance the processes. Ideally, they're integrated into the processes. And so that begs the question, well, what's an organizational process? And a simple definition of this, there's a number of them out there, but a good one is that there are processes of they're combinations rather of people and material, machines, physical facilities, land, energy, and these are integrated so that they occur repetitively to do the organization's work. Okay? And processes can be very simple. They can occur in one place. They can occur in many places, in one part of the organization or across many structural units in an organization. Okay? So there are many different possibilities with organizational processes. And I'll just give you some examples. And for these, I'll use an example, a hypothetical example of a pharmaceutical company, a drug company that brings drugs up to market for the world, really, to sell for different conditions that people have around the world. So a pharmaceutical firm, like Pfizer or some other, will have different processes like order fulfillment, which involves the placing of an order all the way to the fulfillment of the order. So a hospital might place an order for certain drugs that they manufacture, and that's done through an order fulfillment process. The sales process. This is where sales reps go out to hospitals or doctors' offices, medical practices, and they initiate contact at the beginning of the process, and that process culminates in a sale of pharmaceuticals to that medical practice or that hospital. Another one is manufacturing, bringing in raw materials, in this case, pharmacological compounds and chemicals, into the organization, and it completes itself with the manufacture of a ready-made drug. New product development. And this is where you start with the idea of a potential new drug to go to market to serve people, and you end the process with the drug either in the market or ready to go out for regulatory approval to the relevant governments. So these are just examples of processes, and there are many others. Accounting is a process, and so forth. These processes, again, are enhanced and are supported by the KM activities. And we'll take a look at some key activities of KM now. Next slide. The first of these is knowledge creation or knowledge discovery. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at a number of these activities. We'll only look at 5 of these. You can look at these in many ways, as Kendra just said. We'll look at knowledge creation or knowledge discovery, same thing. Knowledge capture, knowledge formalization, knowledge dissemination or sharing, again, that's the same thing, and knowledge application. So first, knowledge discovery. Knowledge discovery occurs when knowledge does not exist and it's brought into existence, usually by or within an organization. And this can be done through some sub-processes. One's called combination and the other is called socialization. In combination, what happens is that explicit knowledge, that is knowledge in some kind of recorded form, usually digitally, is put together in a new way. Literally different content items are put together, integrated, combined into something new, some kind of new knowledge. So for example, a pharmaceutical firm, a drug company could put together prior patents for pharmaceuticals that have been registered in different countries around the world, and or the scholarly literature in pharmacology or organic chemistry, integrate these documents so as to create an idea for a new drug, and maybe even a patent application, a formal application to have a new drug be patented. So that's an example of knowledge discovery, bringing a new idea and the details of a new drug into a recorded form. Socialization, tacit socialization, this occurs very commonly in organizations when people in processes work across the process boundaries. So for example, in a pharmaceutical firm, you might have the manufacturing folks, the customer service people, the R&D people, all work together. The representatives of different processes work together so as to create a better R&D process, one that's a lot quicker, brings drugs more reliably to market, and ones that are much more able to get regulatory approval to market. So that's just an example of knowledge discovery that's tacit knowledge, that is knowledge held in people's minds, that's done through socialization. So related to knowledge creation or discovery is our next activity, and that's knowledge capture. So next slide, please. In knowledge capture, what happens is that knowledge already exists. It either exists within an organization or very commonly outside in the larger world. So it can exist in scholarly literature outside the world, or among consultants, or among an organization's customers. It can exist in a number of places. The idea is it exists, and it has to be identified as relevant knowledge. Right? So attention needs to be brought to bear to it so that people in the organization go from not realizing it exists to realizing that it exists. And this is done through some sub-processes. One's called internalization, and another is called externalization. So in internalization, what happens is explicit knowledge is changed over to tacit knowledge. And this is often what is called really just normal learning, relevant learning, where you read, you view, you listen to recorded content, and from that, absorb what it says mentally. It goes from a recorded form to a mental form. So for example, as a drug company is thinking about developing a new drug to treat some condition, let's say some form of cancer, a scientist working in the firm might read and study extensively the scholarly literature related to earlier versions of earlier similar drugs to the one that's being considered or the condition they might want to treat. So they look in the pharmacological literature, they look in the medical literature, and they study this. And from that, they internalize knowledge. It's in recorded form, they bring it into their mind. And then from this, externalization can often happen. And this is where you take this tacit knowledge and you switch it back to being explicit. And you might do this by then creating from this reading of, say, the scholarly literature, a proposal or an idea for a new drug, right? A new pharmacological agent, a new drug. And again, that might be an initial proposal, it might be a more formal write-up, it might culminate in a patent application of some kind. So the idea there is you're finding knowledge that exists, you're identifying it as such to exist, and you're turning it into something tangible. So that's the idea of knowledge capture. And again, these two often relate, so knowledge discovery and capture often occur really simultaneously to one another. They are connected. Next slide. The next activity I'd like to just mention briefly is what's been called knowledge formalization or knowledge codification. And in formalization or codification, and I know we have a lot of librarians attending today, you're familiar with this. The idea is that you have explicit knowledge in recorded form. So this is not so much done on tacit knowledge, it's done on explicit knowledge. And what happens is that you don't change the knowledge, but what you do is you put some layers in addition to it, or if you will, over top of it. One is called description, and the other is called classification. So in description, what you do is you take formal documents, recorded documents, and you create what's been called metadata. Data about data, meta meaning of the thing, and you record characteristics of the documents in labels. So for example, a pharmaceutical firm may have many different written documents about many different pharmaceuticals, ones that it manufactures and sells, ones that other people manufacture and sell. And so these could be in the form of product descriptions, white papers, all kinds of different things, all kinds of different documents. And those need to be described, maybe by, and described according to attributes. So it may be that you describe the documents according to the diseases they're relevant to. So it might be by their subject, if you will. It could be by their author. You could have metadata about their chronology, when they were created, and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways to affix these labels to these documents. And another thing you can do is classification. And that is you can organize these documents in different ways. So you can organize the documents by the disease that potentially the pharmaceutical agent, the drug, could treat. You could do it by the author's name. You could do it by the nation that's relevant to it. You could do it in any number of ways. And what's powerful is that when you do both of these together, you really speed up tremendously the access to documents, because now they're in recognizable patterns, meaning classified, and there are shorthands, meaning labels or descriptions attached to them, so that you can go in and find all the documents relevant to a particular country, or all the documents relevant to a particular disease. And then you can go into each of those sets and get the subtleties of diseases, well, certain manifestations of the diseases, certain symptoms, and so forth. So you can go in and gain the subtleties. So again, this is a way to add layers of access to what are otherwise often unorganized and sort of raw materials, raw documents. And these can be extremely voluminous. You could have thousands of these documents. So formalization is really a critical tool. Next slide. The next thing that I would like to just briefly touch upon is knowledge sharing or dissemination. In dissemination or sharing, next slide. What happens is that knowledge goes in either explicit form, meaning recorded form, or in mental form, in someone's mind, from one person to another, and or it can go from one unit to another, one process to another, a geographic unit in one part of the world to another geographic unit in another part of the world. So there's knowledge dissemination, knowledge sharing. It's from one individual or one unit to another. Now, some caveats do need to be met to actually have knowledge sharing, as opposed to simple knowledge communication. So you can have communication without sharing, but if you have communication and you meet these caveats, you go up to the next level, and that is sharing. So there's two primary caveats. One is that knowledge is shared when the recipient is able to act upon the shared knowledge. And the other is that knowledge is shared when the recipient gains not just the details of the knowledge, but they gain the context of the knowledge. So for example, if we use our drug company pharmaceutical example, in the first case, let's say that the R&D unit of a pharmaceutical firm, a drug company, has developed a new drug and has brought it up to where it's ready to be in the market. It's gone through regulatory approval. Now it needs, this knowledge of this needs to be transferred over to marketing so that it can be marketed throughout various nations, even around the world. This has to be transferred over, and the knowledge needs to be such that the marketing people can take what's been given to them and actually do their job, market. If they don't have what they need to market, then truly knowledge has not been shared. Knowledge has not been shared. It may have been communicated, but it hasn't been shared. And then the second issue and the second threshold that needs to be met is that there's a context. So if the knowledge is transferred, say from R&D to marketing, but marketing is not sure where this new drug fits in the big picture of the organization, then they don't really know the context. They don't really know what they should emphasize, how it fits in that big picture. So again, if that's the case, the knowledge truly has not been, it's not been truly shared. If both are met, if marketing gets the context and they're able to act on that context, then knowledge sharing has actually occurred. Knowledge sharing can occur in a number of ways. One is through socialization, it's a sub-process, if you will, and another is called exchange. So for example, in socialization, and this usually is how tacit knowledge is shared, that is knowledge held in people's minds. What happens is that you might have, what you have is someone who's an expert spends time, a lot of time usually, verbally interacting with someone that needs to learn the knowledge. So let's say that you have a sales representative that is very expert at selling pharmaceuticals, drugs, to hospitals, medical practices, doctors' offices, public health clinics, and so forth. Well, obviously, these are very sophisticated customers. And so there's a lot to know about selling to them, how to approach them initially for the sale, how to build a relationship, how to close the sale, how to handle problems that come up, questions and things that go wrong. And over time, you know, a new person, a new sales rep has to learn all of this so they're not just thrown out and say, go do it, and then they can have a problem and sink. Instead, you can use socialization to slowly convey this knowledge, transfer it from the more experienced rep to the newer rep. And that may take a couple of years of them working very closely together for that transfer to occur. And another way transfer or sharing dissemination occurs is through exchange. And this is with explicit knowledge. We're literally just share documents back and forth and revise them as you go. So for example, in new product development for a pharmaceutical firm, what they might do is as they're going, share certain documents at certain milestones of development with marketing. Then marketing can make comments, revise the document, send it back. So that's an example of exchange where you're doing things real time and each party can act on that knowledge transfer and make that threshold. So you can have, to review, knowledge discovery, knowledge capture, knowledge formalization, and knowledge sharing or dissemination. And all of this culminates ideally in knowledge application. So next slide, please. Knowledge application can occur so as to lead to a number of things. One is decision making and another is action. We'll focus on these two, and there's some others that you can think of as knowledge application, but these are the two most important, I think. So decision making and action. And as was the case with the other activities, there are some sub-processes that help carry out application. One is called direction, and another is called routinization. So first, decision making. Back to our example of a pharmaceutical firm, they need to make decisions as they go based on what they've learned with regard to, let's say, a new drug that they're bringing to market. So they have an idea, they go through initial steps of development, initial formulation of it, eventually clinical trials, regulatory approval, and so forth. All the different steps. And as they go, they need to make decisions at each step, whether or not, for example, to go to the next step, or whether to wait, or maybe to stop completely. So for example, from clinical trials, they need to learn from that and then make a decision whether to go to the next step, maybe the next level of clinical trials, or to stop based on some things that might have happened during the trials. So the idea here is that application can be thought of as to support and to enhance decision making. Also, application can be used for action. So for example, to actually take a new pharmaceutical that's been developed and bring it up and then to distribute it throughout the world, manufacture it at scale, distribute it throughout the world, and market it, right? So the manufacturing, distribution, and marketing of it. And this can be done, and this is action, extensive action, and action done at a large scale. Again, these can be done through direction or routinization. Just some simple examples. Direction is an example, is a case where knowledge is communicated, but isn't necessarily disseminated or formally shared, because some of the thresholds are not necessarily met. In knowledge direction, what happens is usually one person shares knowledge or communicates knowledge with another person, but doesn't necessarily convey the context of the knowledge. So let's say that they're manufacturing a pharmaceutical at a huge scale, millions of doses, and there's a problem with the equipment in the manufacturing facility. So the equipment breaks, and therefore the process stops. Well, the production worker calls an expert who engineered the equipment. And over the phone, the expert tells the production worker what to do to fix the piece of equipment. It takes 20 minutes, they do it, and boom, it works. It's back working again. What's happened there is direction. The expert guided the production worker, but the production worker doesn't understand why what works. So they did what they were told, they saw that it works, but they don't understand why it works. They just accept that it does. So that's direction. And in this case, they were able to apply that knowledge to get that equipment working again, to action. In routinization, what happens is processes are developed and are continued. So you are manufacturing a pharmaceutical. Again, tremendous amount of knowledge is made repetitive through its embedding in equipment, machines, people, facilities, and so forth. So in a sense, knowledge application is the culmination, it's the central activity, because it's the end to which the others go. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do next is to just talk a little bit about the mechanisms and the means whereby these activities upon knowledge, discovery, capture, formalization, dissemination, and application are supported. How do we support these? We do it through two primary means. One are what we call social mechanisms, and the other are through technologies. So for example, with social mechanisms, these are ongoing patterns of activity in organizations, and there are a lot of these. On the other hand, technologies are things that are outside of, separate from people, that they use in order to do things. So for social mechanisms, these are patterns that support KM, and for these technologies, these are knowledge-related technologies that support KM. What we have here is a list of some social mechanisms. This is some of them, not all of them by any means, and I won't talk about all of these. I'll just mention a few of these selectively. Many of you may have heard of these, but if not, they're widely used. One is called the pursuit and the use of best practices. So for example, in manufacturing something complex that has to be done very precisely, like a pharmaceutical, there may be commonly used best practices for doing this. These can be used throughout the world. And an organization can make a point socially of finding out what those practices are and then using them, applying them. Cooperative work. This is where teams work together, processes coordinate with one another in order to get things done. So manufacturing can coordinate with marketing in order to do what they do better, but both do better. The idea of pursuing and using lessons learned. So for example, bringing a new pharmaceutical to market is extraordinarily complex and expensive, and you learn a lot, good and bad, as you go. So you have successes and you have problems and failures. It's worthwhile to record what those are, to recognize those explicitly, and then to apply those in subsequent instances of doing the same thing, bringing new drugs to market later on, a number of years later. Lessons learned can be both positive and negative. They're a little different than best practices, which are inherently only positive. Meetings, that's a social mechanism. And obviously meetings can exist for a lot of reasons, to communicate, to decide, to act, and so forth. And meetings are their own area of expertise, but they're extremely powerful because they're a way people can come together to engage with knowledge. And then finally, prototyping. I'll just mention that briefly. Prototyping is important because it allows you to make an example of something before it goes fully live. And pharmaceutical firms do this a lot. They will develop, if you will, a beta version of the drug, clinical version. And this is tested in controlled and clinical tests, often at different places in the world, on hundreds or even thousands of people. And then the results are reported and they react to that before the drug is made, if you will, live, mass distribution throughout the world. So this is a simple thing. This is the prototyping, social process of pursuing and doing prototyping. Next slide. Next is technologies, and some of these are parallel to the mechanism. So for example, as a social mechanism, an organization can pursue and do best practices, but it can also record those in a database. You can have a best practices database. You can do the same thing with lessons learned. You can pursue and use lessons learned, and you can record them in a repository or a database. And that way you've got them. If in subsequent years you do new drug development, you can go back to that database, that repository, and look up what the lessons learned were. Social media is a very powerful KM technology. So for example, a drug company that operates around the world, what it can do is to monitor social media and to find, well, people's experiences using the drugs that they are marketing and selling throughout the world. You know, if they're having good experiences, they can learn about that. If they're having bad experiences, they can learn about that. Not only to maybe contact the person, let's say, that's having a bad experience, but just in generally to learn what's going on and then to adapt what they do as a result of what they learn. And obviously things like video conferencing. I mean, we're doing this right now, but organizations can do this at scale in order to move a new product development, like a new pharmaceutical, along. They can use video conferencing. So there are many of these technologies. Some of them are parallel with the social mechanisms. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do for a minute now, now that we've talked about KM's, its background, a little bit about its knowledge, we've talked about its activities, we've talked about its social mechanisms and its technologies and so forth. Just touch on the relationship as we see it, or at least part of the relationship as we see it, between knowledge management and librarianship. Because I know we have some folks that are knowledge managers that are attending. We also have some librarians that are attending. We've come to feel that one way to think about this is that KM and librarianship overlap with one another in one sense, and yet are distinct from one another. And that can be represented in the Venn diagram as you see here. So one way to think about it is that KM has a claim of coverage that is unique to itself and overlaps with librarianship. Librarianship has a claim of coverage which is unique to itself and overlaps with KM. And then they also have a joint claim that overlaps with one another. They basically both claim the same thing, coverage of the same thing. So KM covers knowledge that is held tacitly in people's minds, particularly in organizations, but not exclusively there. Librarianship does not claim this. It claims recorded content in several forms, but not people's tacit knowledge. It doesn't claim to cover that. What librarianship has unique to it, distinct to it from KM, is that it covers what can be called recorded works of the imagination. So these are not per se recorded works of knowledge, but they are recorded works of ideas and thought. So literature, art, things like this, philosophy. These are things that aren't per se, may or may not be considered knowledge, but they might be considered artistic expression, reflection, and so forth, that they exist in recorded form. Librarianship covers these, claims these. Knowledge management does not. What they both seem to claim as a joint thing is knowledge that exists in explicit form. So explicitly recorded knowledge. KM covers this, and librarianship covers this. So an example would be the scholarly literature in all kinds of disciplines, the world scholarly literature in chemistry, organic chemistry, or physics, or whatever, economics, whatever the discipline might be. KM might claim this, would claim this as in its coverage. Librarianship would as well. So I think these are some critical differences between KM and librarianship. There's also some cultural differences, which we could talk about if you have some questions on that. As Kendra and I have been learning about KM, and our background is in librarianship and library information science. So for us, this has been an expansion of what we know and what we've been exposed to in our careers. It's been very enjoyable, but it's been interesting to see the different cultures of the two worlds, if you will. So I'll go ahead and wrap this up. I'll turn this back over to Kendra, and what she will do is to take you through the beginnings of how you can carry this out in an organization. How can you actually implement KM in an organization? Kendra?
Thanks, Bill.
Kendra, if you allow me just to interrupt here,
Sure.
just to give an announcement for the wonderful attendees with us. All the questions that need to be asked for Kendra or Bill could be postponed to the end of the presentation, please. And you can write it down on the chat box down there, or question and answer box, and we will come to it one by one by all of us. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Okay, so as Bill said, what we've done is we've actually just sort of looked back over the processes, the activities, the technologies used in KM. And what we want to do now is to look at a way that you can approach KM through a series of phases. And this is a practice that we've learned and we've developed in a little bit more detail that comprise 4 steps. The first one is initiation. The second one is discovery. The third one is design, and the fourth one is in implementation. And we're going to go through each of these in just a little bit of detail, just to give you an overview so you have a sense of the process as you go through a KM developing a KM project. So the first of these, I'll do the first 2, and then Bill will do the second 2. And the very first one is the initiation phase. And this is where we collect as much information about the organization as we can overall. This is where we want to make sure we understand the project requirements. We also will want to confirm those with the organization that we're working with to make sure that we have a clear understanding of not only what we're interpreting and seeing within the organization, but also the scope of the project itself. So it's important here to collect information on the mission, the goals, objectives, and the vision. It's funny how people don't always think about the vision. And sometimes organizations don't have a vision statement, but they know it. And so it's helpful to extract that tacit knowledge from the leadership to find out what their vision is. Where do they really want to take the organization? It's also helpful then to have that operational understanding, like an organizational chart. You know, who reports to whom, who are the experts in particular things organizationally, what are they responsible for, as well as the strategic plan, which tells you a little bit more about where the organization is planning to go. So the importance of those is to make sure that you align the KM strategy with that of the organization. And you also need to take into account the business value and the measurement for how they determine business value. That can include some of these things, like what does operational excellence mean to this organization? It may not mean the same thing as it does to the organization next door. So how do they define operational excellence? How can KM help them get to that kind of excellence that they would like to achieve? How can we integrate KM to build that true learning organization through continuous improvement? And then also, how do we align the community processes and the culture that exists within that organization with the strategic priorities, utilizing the communities of practice? And then also, how do we identify and establish techniques for measuring KM effectiveness and results? So for example, a balanced scorecard is a very common method that's used, but what goes into that scorecard may be unique to that particular organization. So you need to get this general strategic and operational understanding of the organization, what it is they'd like to achieve, and make sure that the scope of the project is clearly understood by everyone. The second step is discovery. This phase continues that investigative process that we use in initiation, but it focuses more deeply on the communities within the organization. So for example, how does the organizational community, and that can be defined as like a collaborative network, communities of practice, or just a small team, how do they envision their own strategies? How do their strategies align with that of the organization? Because when there's a disconnect between those, that's an area that could be strengthened and should be addressed by the KM processes. How do they locate necessary expertise within the organization? This is a tough one because everybody, when you have an organization like General Electric, for example, has 10,000 employees across multiple countries, how do you make sure you know who to find? Who's the expert in that area? How do you find them? Does that expert locator exist in any kind of structured, systematic way? If it does, is there a way to improve that? If it doesn't, perhaps that's an area that could be developed. If there isn't one that exists to help find that kind of expertise, you might want to find out what barriers exist, for example, in finding that expertise. Is it a system problem? Is it that there isn't expertise in that area? Those kinds of questions need to be answered. And then the bottom line of that is who shares what information with whom and under what circumstances. And then how do they communicate that needed information? How is it shared? What information creates a bottleneck? What information is hard to get located and why? How can the bottlenecks be addressed so that information flows more freely? So we need to take into account all of these different kinds of depth of feelings, depth of knowledge about the communities within the organization. And then finally, we need to know what kind of information is needed by whom and when. How is that information used and applied within the organization? What tools, going back to Bill's points about the technologies, what tools could help facilitate that use? What current tools exist? You know, for example, we've been working on a project that we know, an organization that uses SharePoint and Salesforce, but maybe what they need is another tool like MediaWiki to establish an expert database locator. Then also, how are the tools being used? And then can they be revised to be more helpful? Because, you know, if you have existing tools that could be used in a way that's helpful to that organization, maybe you don't need to get new tools. Maybe you just need to review and revise the ways in which the existing tools are being used. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bill to talk about the design phase.
All right, thank you, Kendra. So the next two phases, design and implementation, after the first two, in a sense, are where you move from, to use a medical analogy, you move from really diagnosing the situation in the first two phases. You go into an organization, or you're already in the organization, and you try to sort out what's happening strategically, what are the organization's priorities, initiatives, problems, opportunities, what knowledge does it have? How might knowledge management support what it's doing, its opportunities, and its deal with its concerns and its problems? All of that is to assess the situation. In a sense, it's to try to diagnose what's going on. Next, you move to design, and then ultimately beyond that to implementation. In design, in a sense, what you do is you move to treatment. You've diagnosed the situation, and now you move to thinking about and to design, to develop a treatment, to plan that treatment. Not yet to carry it out, but to plan it. And you've got to deal with a number of different issues here. How does information flow, organizational processes, technologies, and so forth. And one way to go about doing this is to think about a fundamental unit of KM. And we've come to call this the KM system. And an organization will have at least one KM system, and often it has several. And ideally, you want these KM systems to integrate into an overall KM program or process. You could think of it as a supporting process that could enhance the other processes in the organization that we've talked about. So each KM system needs to have some things that we already touched upon a little bit earlier. you would think about, well, what, to use the pharmaceutical example again of a drug company, what knowledge do you want to serve there? What is their knowledge? The knowledge with regard to pharmacology, organic chemistry, specific drugs, specific medical conditions, maybe forms of cancer, for example, they want to develop drugs for. So what's the knowledge that you want to serve? The next step would be, what are your knowledge activities that you want to enhance, that you want to engage in? You want to do knowledge discovery, you want to do knowledge capture, formalization, sharing, application. It's often the case that any given one KM system will focus on one or two of these activities, discovery or capture or sharing. And then the challenge becomes to integrate, say, 2 or 3 of these into a larger whole. You also will have the social mechanisms within each of these systems. So you might have a social mechanism, or you might have a KM system that's supporting, let's say, the knowledge that is to be captured there has to do with pharmacology and organic chemistry very broadly. And so this is a knowledge discovery. It's a knowledge discovery, a knowledge capture process, KM process. The social mechanism that you might use for that would be to pursue very extensively searching in the literature, scholarly literature, make that a priority, to do that regularly. And the tools that you might use would include the bibliographic databases covering these fields, pharmacology, organic chemistry, and so forth. Conversely, you might have a knowledge application process that supports pharmaceutical development and eventual distribution. So for example, there, it could be knowledge, same body of knowledge, but you're doing knowledge application and you're using social tools like prototyping, and you're using prototyping or modeling software as the technology to support this. So the point is that in design, you deliberately identify what these KM systems will be, the relevant knowledge, the activities you're interested in, the KM activities you're interested in, the mechanisms, the social mechanisms, the technologies, and of course, the processes you want to support, such as, let's say, new product development, new drug development for a pharmaceutical firm. And you integrate these, and you do this deliberately in your design. And then that leads to the next phase, which is implementation. Next slide, please. And in implementation, literally what you do is you carry out the design. And this can take a short amount of time, but it often takes a long time, because what you have to do is to actually do it. It may mean starting something new with regard to KM. It may be revising something that already exists with regard to KM, but it means starting the activities or revising the activities. It may mean accessing the knowledge if you haven't already. It may mean developing and instituting new social mechanisms or new technologies, or revising the ones that you have. So this is basically organizational change very commonly. And so as Kendra was saying, you have to use models of change, and the basic insight that was shared is exactly right, that organizations really are about the people, and people in organizations have to change. Either you change the current people and or you gain new people. But in implementation, you are dealing with all of these things. And again, what you're doing in implementation ultimately is you're orienting KM outside of itself into relationship to the other organization, like partnerships, but primarily into integrating into these organizational processes to enhance them and to support them. What we'll do now, and I'll turn this back over to Kendra, is to talk about some considerations that you might want to keep in mind as you consider KM and as you carry KM out in an organization. Kendra?
All righty, thank you, Bill. So we've just given you a sort of an overview of a phased approach that we can use to employ those processes, activities, and technology to facilitate the information flows and knowledge sharing within the organization. So there's a couple of important considerations that Bill and I were talking about, and we decided we would just kind of call them tips. So these are kind of just some tips that we've learned that I thought we might want to share with you guys. So we'll just discuss those very briefly. The first one has to do with knowledge sharing. There's some key aspects of knowledge sharing that are very important, and they vary by organization, but perhaps most importantly, they vary by culture. And I can't stress that enough, that cultural differences throughout the world will impact the ways in which knowledge is shared. So the first thing that I would share with you is that knowledge sharing is a process that needs to be done by everyone. It is a necessary it's a necessary part of being a sufficient condition for a KM process to work. So you have to have the knowledge sharing. To facilitate that sharing, it's very helpful for people to know where the official spaces are for sharing that information, like tools to use, where to store your documents, how you're going to capture the tacit knowledge, the directory and expert information that might exist, as well as just the sharing around the water cooler, which is what we say in the United States, the water cooler being a place that has, nice chilled water and everybody can go get a drink of water during the workday, and conversations might take place. These social spaces that exist in workplace settings physically that are sometimes really hard to emulate in a virtual meeting such as this. But nonetheless, that knowledge sharing, we need to find those ways that work within the particular environment that you're working in, as well as the culture that you're working in. So if you have information that requires special kinds of treatment, like legal documents or classified materials, everybody needs to know how those are to be treated and where those are to be kept. So that's that codification of the explicit knowledge. Information and knowledge should not be kept in private places. You don't want to store them on your own computer, because then nobody's going to know where they are, or they'll only know that you have that information. And that can lead to a practice we call information hoarding, or in library terms, sometimes we refer to those people as gatekeepers, that they are not necessarily readily sharing that information, that they want people to come to them to get it, and then they'll decide whether or not to share that information. And that creates barriers for the organization to move in the direction that it wants to, if it wants to become that true learning organization. Further, the sharing should be managed through automatic tools that reduce that temptation to hoard information or to dominate the knowledge sharing practices. So these practices like that, whether you are an oversharer or an undersharer of information, those invoke behaviors that are contradictory to best practices in KM. So the bottom line here is that knowledge sharing is very important, and it's important that it be practiced equally as much as possible across the organization, and as well with your stakeholder groups that are important. So for example, I did a number of studies, and some of my colleagues here today have heard this, but I did a number of studies with a variety of agencies and organizations in Uganda about HIV/AIDS reduction back in the early 2000s through about 2006. And collectively, when we look at the ways in which Uganda was so successful at reversing the prevalence of HIV, it did it through a series of different things that all worked together to make that happen. And a lot of it was based on the fact that these organizations, whether it was the government organizations like the Uganda AIDS Commission, or the individual organizations, multilateral organizations, community-based organizations, civil society, all of these groups, as well as NGOs like the Rakai Project, which was a joint venture including Columbia University. World Vision was another organization that we mapped the flows of information through. The one thing they all did was they were transparent about it. They included all of their stakeholders in the sharing of that information, so that it ultimately created an information grid that nobody could escape. It was all about sharing information and educating the population in Uganda about good practices to prevent HIV spread. And so that transparency and the sharing of information needs to be shared with everyone, including the point where you make best practices. That when you're writing the best practices or the lessons learned, it's not like there's an organizer who should come in and say, well, you know what, we'll clean up here, we'll write the best practices, and then we'll share it with everybody. That in itself is not a best practice, because it needs to include all voices at the table equally to have their input into what they consider to be best practices. So that it could be that someone records that, but the voices at the table need to all be heard equally and have the right to speak about what they understood to be their best practices. So that's the tip about knowledge sharing. And then the other thing we wanted to talk about is, well, how do you facilitate that, right? How do you get people to practice good knowledge sharing? So one of the things that you need to do is to always celebrate all the good things that are going on, not just with knowledge sharing, but across the organization. Good knowledge management practices should be recognized, rewarded, and important. Celebrate them. Celebrate them. This builds that community. It strengthens the ties that exist between different pieces of the organization and facilitates KM unto itself. So how do you know if these are going on? Well, you need to investigate how collaboration works within that organization, and you should have established a good baseline for that during the discovery phase. So you need to then follow up on that regularly to ensure that that continues to improve how that collaboration is going. KM is not a static process. It is an ongoing process that needs to keep going. Concurrently, you can establish how good practices will be officially recognized and rewarded. So you could establish like performance management practices that could be included in people's evaluations. That's one good way to do it. You also need to establish the criteria by which those best practices will be measured, because not everyone necessarily meets those, but you need to establish a goal for everyone to try to achieve. You also need to formalize a recognition and rewards program that everybody knows about and everyone is eligible to participate in. It's not just for a select few, it's for everyone. And you need to create processes that can exist within communities, not only at the level of the entire organization, but it could be at lower levels too. So you could have certificates, for example. There was a job that I had once that they gave, an organization that gave the Extra Mile Award. That means that somebody did an extra super job and they went that extra mile to try to help somebody out. And so those kinds of awards may not carry any monetary value, but they still make people feel good and like they're part of something. So those are some of the incentives that can be really helpful in maintaining and continuing the improvements in a KM practice. All right, I'm going to switch now because we have a little time left to do a case study. I'm just watching the time. And I'd like to get you guys to help me by putting our heads together collectively. We're going to do a little knowledge management practice ourselves and try a simple case study. In this exercise, I'd really like to just have you think about this as this is a real situation in a real company and see what you guys can come up with. Then I'd like you to respond by putting just your ideas in the chat box. Just put it in the chat with some ideas of how you might approach the problem when I tell you what that problem is. And then just a couple of minutes after we've had a chance to brainstorm a little bit, I'm going to tell you what the company did that was considered the gold standard KM response. Okay, so just to review, I'm going to tell you a case study in just a second. Then I want you to say, I'm going to tell you the problem, and then you can put some ideas in the chat box, and then we'll come back and look at what they actually did. So here's the case study. This is the oil company Shell that was having trouble retaining critical knowledge, and so they established a program called ROCK. This was, the background was that they had a lot of retirees who were leaving the company, and the purpose of this project, or this this project was to capture their knowledge to meet the challenge of the big crew change. That means the anticipated loss of a majority of experienced petroleum industry staff that was projected to occur. So they wanted to capture the knowledge before it left as people retired. So the questions I'm putting to you is, how could Shell capture this knowledge from these retirees, and how could that knowledge be utilized within the company? So just type your ideas into chat. The question that you're answering is just some brainstorm. You can just use simple words that would explain it. How could Shell capture that knowledge? And then how could they use that knowledge within the company? Communities of practice. Excellent. Excellent. That's a very good idea. What else could they do? Exit interviews and focus groups. Bingo. You guys are on it. You are definitely getting there. This is great. Communities of practice, exit interviews, focus groups. Anybody have other ideas they'd want to add? Publish a huge book. That's right. Exit interviews. You guys, oh yes. Asked to write their experiences. These are all great ideas. Put that question on the chat, please. Can I get you to do that, Abdallah? Just to maybe put something in there. Brainstorming survey.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so you guys you are spot on, and I'll tell you in a minute what they actually did, and I think you're very much on the mark. The second part of the question is, how could that knowledge be used within the company? So once you publish that huge book, once you do those exit interviews, how can they use it within the company? What could they do? Case studies is another one, yes. Prototype. A prototype's a good idea. Bill mentioned prototyping. It's a really important aspect. A knowledge management system, share with new employees. Oh my gosh, you guys are all experts. Look at this. This is wonderful. A roundtable meeting. Oh my gosh, they didn't even include all your ideas. They needed to get you guys on the team. Oh, that's great. How could that, right? Formulate policies based on the findings. Train new employees about the knowledge. Manuals. You guys you're the best. So let me show you what they actually did. It won't be any surprise to you guys. They did a structured interview process. They did this with tape recorder, pen and paper. They used a trained interviewer, so they had reasons that they didn't want to do them themselves. Sometimes people feel like it's better to have someone who's not biased to do the interviews. They asked for volunteers. They did not give any incentives for people. They just asked for volunteers. And then from the pool of volunteers, they selected certain interviewees that were based on their perceived knowledge, and being selected to participate was considered an honor. Then also senior managers sat in on the interviews and helped to ask additional questions to draw out some of the subtleties that they really felt needed to be captured. And the interviews themselves took up to 12 hours to complete. So it was an extensive set of interviews. And then in terms of what else they did, they captured that knowledge recorded as a reference tool. And guess what? It was shared with communities of practice. They had lunch and learn sessions. And then they had an internal online huge book called an encyclopedia arranged by topic. So you guys are spot on with this. So in sum, Shell captured that expert knowledge and shared that knowledge across the entire company around the world. That knowledge is also now embedded within the organization, and it links business processes and organizational learning. The process of knowledge capture and sharing is sustainable, and they're still doing it. So one of the key takeaways about KM in general is that it's a continuous process. It doesn't stop. Once you start, we described you how to start and do a KM project, but what we didn't tell you is that it has to continue. That same process goes on and on and on and on and on. So when we talk about implementing KM in any organization, what's very important to remember is that it needs to have the staff dedicated to it to maintain it so that it actually will continue. It's not a one-time thing to do the kind of organizational repositioning to get those efficiencies, to get those cost savings, to help it to continue to be the learning organization you want it to be. And with that, we have completed our overview of KM, and I'd like to open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Kendra, so much, and thank you, Bill, for this very informative session and webinar. And I would start inviting the attendees to write down their question, because actually some of them already started this one, and I try to collect it. I will open the door for question by raising a question from my side. I hope that it will be just looks like appetizer for this thing. He will talk about sharing knowledge, and let's put it in this context. Sharing knowledge has many benefits for the organization. So how do you define the benefits for the individual within the organization, especially that not few, I think many of us thinking that when I share my knowledge, I lose my power, I lose my position. So how you convince us, and try to play this role here, how you convince us that when I share my knowledge, this will not affect negatively on my position, my credit within the organization?
Right. That's a very good question. That's a really an important question. And I touched upon that in those tips. This is why we included them, because I think it's such an important aspect. I think the cultural piece of this is, for example, in the United States, people are typically pretty good at sharing information. We are, as you guys probably all know, we talk a lot. We're very engaged in talking. And so other cultures, and it's not that it doesn't happen here too. We have that information preservation, if you will, that we are trying to protect our jobs and our prestige and our positions by holding the information as much as we can. The organization can make it a formal process to reward knowledge sharing through the use of these kinds of incentives. For example, in your performance reviews, different organizations use different kinds of performance review instruments or processes. And so there could be a question, for example, that would evaluate people based on their knowledge sharing practices. And so that's one of the formal ways that it has been codified in some organizations in their KM processes, and that's one that's often recommended. But there are less formal ways of doing that too. Certainly putting people in teams to share, and then rewarding the sharing of those teams and the communities of practice that we have, and encouraging the use of those tools, the knowledge tools, some of the things that Bill talked about, like social media, is how do you encourage people to be more socially engaged within the organization? I know people used to say, well, I can't stand around here and talk all day. I've got to get back to work. But in reality, now what we know is that standing around at the water cooler example I gave earlier is where a lot of innovation and knowledge sharing goes on. People brainstorm. They're not just standing around chit-chatting. And even if they are, it leads to innovative projects and discussions that come from that. There's been research in the United States on the ways in which women network, for example. Women in the United States and probably in Western Europe, if I'm not mistaken, network as friendships. They build lifelong friendships. And so the sharing that goes on is much more engaged with trust. And so because they're friends, they feel like they can trust each other, and therefore they're more forthcoming with sharing knowledge. So there's both those formal structures and those informal structures that can be developed within an organization and built into the KM process to help facilitate that knowledge sharing and help people understand that you're going to get rewarded for sharing, not for hoarding, as I always say. Mm-hmm. Bill, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think that if an organization is a place that is going to be doing really worthwhile things, it's an exciting place to work, that happens because there is an atmosphere it's an intellectually exciting atmosphere where people realize they're doing something important, they realize they're doing it really well. It's exciting to be at work. And that buzz and that energy comes from the constant interaction and the sharing that happens over the water cooler, it happens in meetings, it happens in phone conversations, it happens in all kinds of ways, socialization and so forth. People just spending time together, and what you want is an environment that is just, it's exciting. It's exciting to be there. It's fun to be there, and so the sharing of knowledge is just part of it. It just happens because there's so many interesting things going on. And people come to understand that their place in the organization is based on their contribution to that accomplishment and their participation in that exciting dynamic. It's not in hoarding. It's not in hiding. It's not in hoarding. It's in that, you know, the organization exists so that you can do things as a group, as a collective that you can't do by yourself. And so your status in the organization is your contribution to that collective. And part of that is knowledge sharing. So it's both, as Kendra was saying, you build in the processes, you build in the rewards and performance review and so forth, but you also have this overall orientation of everyone's contributing, everyone's benefiting, and it's an exciting place to be.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And you remind me about a quote just I heard a long time ago about the love and knowledge is the only two resources that increase by taking from it or sharing. Any other resource would be just getting down or not increase or not grow. Okay, we have another question here. It's I try to crystallize and also just classify the question that relate to each other. Salma and also Abir, and they're talking about just more enlightenment on applying knowledge management, especially in universities. Do you have just sample or examples for leader universities that already applying knowledge management on different aspects like organizational aspect or technology or whatever it is? So could you elaborate more on this?
Bill, you want to take a crack at that one first?
For universities?
Yeah, but already just applying knowledge, yes, please.
I think that, or just in general, I think that it's difficult, and I think one of the challenges that happens in knowledge management is that you have different models of organizational life, right? Different patterns they follow. One's been called sort of a mechanized bureaucracy, so a large-scale manufacturer of automobiles or a refiner of oil. That's one thing. Another has been called a professional bureaucracy. That's a university where the faculty are independent operators, essentially, to a great degree. I mean, they are all doing their own thing. You might have another organization that's what's been called an adhocracy, and it's, say, a tech startup, high-tech startup. You've got 10 or 15 people, and they're trying to change the world, and they're 2 or 3 years old, and just trying to just work all the time and get a bunch of things done. And so you have to really think through with KM and there's other models besides these. You have to think through what organizational model are you going into. And what can be exceptionally complex is that you can have an organization with multiple models. So you can have one organization that in one division is a mechanical bureaucracy, and another is a professional bureaucracy, and in a third is an adhocracy. And how you would go about doing KM in each of those, it's different environments. And all else equal, some of these models are more open to change and some are less so. An adhocracy that's what they're doing. They're enmeshed in change, trying to bring it about. They're literally going ad hoc, moment by moment, day by day, trying to figure out who they are and what difference they're going to make. In a mechanized situation, a mechanical bureaucracy, where you're doing, say, large-scale manufacturing, things are pretty stable, and that's the point, is the stability. They're manufacturing huge numbers of pharmaceutical doses or automobiles or whatever. So they're different environments, and you go in those environments with different approaches, and the reality is that there's going to be they're going to be more open to change, some less open to change. In particular for universities, because they're kind of a mix. On the one hand, they're a professional bureaucracy where the faculty are all more or less independent operators, strong personalities, very knowledgeable, very ambitious, etc. On the other hand, they're mechanized in their operations. When you start looking at large-scale things like how they deal with students, you know, resident life, registrar, all that. So they're sort of split animals. They're not only one or the other, they're both. And so if you were to do KM, you have to think about, okay, which environment am I going into, or both? I mean, you go into both. Well, that makes it even more complicated. You know, I've often thought, I spent a lot of time in universities, that there really are, the president of the university has the most difficult job I could ever think of, because on the one hand, he or she has to deal with the larger world, parents and business people that contribute money, and they're on the board of directors and all of that. On the other hand, he or she has to deal with the faculty, you know, and the people in the board of directors and the parents and all, they tend to be local people, where the faculty are global people. Very different. And they have to manage that, he or she has to manage that real time. So if you were to work with senior leadership in that environment, you have to keep all that in mind and manage those things simultaneously. So what we're learning, Kendra and I are learning, is that there's no grab bag. You can't just reach for a bag and pull out, you know, the same 2 or 3 things in any given setting and say, this is what you need. It doesn't work that way. You go into all kinds of different environments with all kinds of different constraints and possibilities. So, and universities are exceptionally complicated animals. They really are, because not only can you have the split between administration and the faculty, you can have subsplits in both of those worlds. I mean, all kinds of different administrative and support units and all kinds of different departments. It's easy to have in a major university 50 or 60 different departments, even upwards of 100, all with different cultures. Okay. So I think what we're learning as we're getting into this is it just depends on your situation. So, Kendra, you want to add to that?
Yes, if I may, because I think this will answer some of the questions, the other questions that are there, because I know we're about out of time. And that is that because everything is so unique to the organization, first of all, you do have to have the senior management support no matter what organization you're in. So I'm going to bring this to a much more practical aspect, and that is, if you're a librarian, for example, and you're being asked to implement knowledge management within your library, that's great. But you need to make sure that your director of the library is supportive of that, and that they understand the kind of commitment that it takes to make that work. Yeah. So I think that's important. And Stephanie asked about generation gaps, and Tarek asked about trust. And I want to say trust is inherently important, and you have to build that. That takes a while. It's something that has to be structured into the KM process. And generational gaps are true, and they are real, just like religion and political gaps, and that there has to be an open honesty and sharing environment that has to be facilitated from the top down. And it's very important to keep doing it. Now, remember, KM system is a long process. Yeah, but how do you know when you're there? It can be short in some ways and hard and long in other ways. So it's an ongoing process. It's not something you do once. It's something that goes on and on and on, and you need your senior management to understand and to make the commitment. If you're going to be the person in charge of KM, you have to have that ongoing commitment, like you're not going to be working the reference desk at the same time. You know, you need to make sure that they understand the resources that are necessary to make this work and to keep it going after the processes seem to be done, because, you know, strategies change, strategic plans change, operational processes change, and management changes. So there has to be that whole commitment by the organization. And I can tell you, I've been in organizations in universities that don't do that. They change their mind, and the next director says, oh, I'm not interested in that. And you've just spent 5 years of your life committing to. So it's important. But this is where measurement and evaluation come in, because then you can demonstrate. And this is something that works very well for us in libraries, is that we have metrics, we have ways of measuring not only the quantitative outcomes, but that's easier in KM because of certain processes you can do. But what I would caution you about is that if you're a librarian and you're asked to do a KM process for the university, I think that's you need to go work for the president of the university if you're going to do that. That's a tall order.
Yeah, it's a long journey, I guess.
It's a long journey, yeah.
And I, please, building knowledge management culture. I think it's not a one-shot thing. It's a long process. It needs a lot of influencer. It's a lot of stakeholder just to having a common understanding, and at the same time a support for the people just working on this one. We have Dr. Farwat Alimi here. He's asking about what are the obstacles that hinder of the application of KM. What is the obstacle that I think that facing applying KM? Thank you, Dr. Farwat.
I'd say for me, the biggest obstacle is not having that senior support. Yeah.
Budget could be one of the barriers. Yes, Bill, please.
Well, and it's not having the senior support. That's fairly common. And I think that in some cultures, and I will say I think it's as true in American culture, I don't know that it's true in all cultures. A lot of times in organizations, they are not, the senior leadership and others in the organization are not conscious, very conscious of the ideas that they are using. They're not conscious of the ideas that are relevant to what they are doing. And the fact that if they change their organization, for example, they've changed the set of relevant ideas. So if you have a university that goes from being, say, one type of university, one that's oriented around teaching, it's like a public affairs university, then it changes to becoming more of a research university. Well, it just shifted the relevant ideas of that organization. Right now it has to understand what a research university is. And it's very common, at least in American culture, that leadership doesn't understand that. They're not aware of these ideas, much less the knowledge that's derived from those ideas that they now need to understand and engage with. And it's convincing them. It's making that case that you need to do this. You need to become aware of these ideas and you need to engage in these ideas. And as Kendra said, you can work with an organization for quite a while, a number of years, and then there's a switch in leadership. The new person comes in and all of that awareness that you built up could be wiped out. Or conversely, you might be getting nowhere with a current director or leader and somebody else comes in and they get it. And all of a sudden, doors that were shut now open up.
Perfect.
But there are things that you can do to inspire the senior management, even when there's a change. If you can demonstrate, for example, cost effectiveness to the organization, that's going to help sell that. And that can happen quickly. Those cost effectiveness things.
Quick win to the organization, yes. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Farwat elaborate more on his question and ask me that do you think that having a department just allocated or specifically for knowledge management in the organizational structure in the university or something like that will help in such passing or overcoming this barrier?
I do. I think that, when I've talked, our experience, I think, is the recognition that it's not a one-time thing implies that there needs to be at least some designated staff that are responsible for maintaining the KM program and adapting it and managing the change. And so I think if it's not a full department, at least it needs to be some dedicated staff. And typically it needs to be, depending on the size of the organization, more than one person. Bill and I are working on a project that has a team of maybe 12 to 15 people, but there's 2 of us because I think that it requires that to make sure that it's done properly from the beginning for this project. Yeah.
Perfect. Related to this question, I'm just working back and forth to the question just to pick the question that related to each other. The culture of the organization is extremely important. Is that the human resources, or the librarian, is the top management, the ownership of the knowledge management program would be related to which of those? We have the librarian, we have the human resources, we have the top management. I think Mr. Najeeb is asking about that, which of those just should be responsible for the knowledge management program in the organization? Or it's a shared responsibility? Shared responsibility. Please elaborate on this, yeah. Bell, please. Yes.
I think knowledge management is not specific to librarians, and I don't think it should necessarily be specific to librarians. It is the responsibility of the entire organization. And I think that the team that's responsible for carrying that out should be, I mean, certainly a librarian has the capabilities of doing this. There's no question about it. The trick is that sometimes you need expertise on the KM team that understands, for example, business processes very well. I did not come originally to librarianship with a business background, but I got one over the period of time that I worked in librarianship, and then through my academic career has involved business, specifically economics. So it's been really helpful to have gained that. So a librarian may not have all of the skills. The good thing about a librarian is that she or he knows what skills they need and how to go find them.
Bill, have more elaboration on this, please.
Yes, I think, I mean, the cultural thing is critically important because organizations as cultures, they have a momentum, stated positively or stated negatively, they have an inertia. And this is just what it is. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It actually provides for continuity and stability in life so that when you go to work every day, you're not reinventing the world. I mean, you know for the most part what's going to happen and what you're expected to do and so forth. So this is good. But it can become an obstacle if it's, for example, the culture is excessively resistant to change. Right? It can become an advantage if it's excessively receptive to change. There are organizations like that. I think that's one of the things that's critical is that a organization that decides to engage with KM needs to grant KM the status of being at the top level, among the top level decision makers. So if you think about it, there's an organization has what we could call the big person table, where when the big decisions are made, who's there? Well, finance, engineering, marketing, R&D, et cetera. These are the big people. KM needs to be there. It needs to be there in that ongoing conversation among the major decision makers. And when those decisions are made, KM needs to be incorporated into that. And that needs to be part of the culture. And if that happens, then other cultural things, other changes and continuity can flow out from that. Conversely, if that doesn't happen, KM can really struggle against a culture that is, it struggles against that inertia. With that, it can be part of the cultural momentum. So it's about, and what you're doing when you do that with KM is what you're saying is the ideas that aggregate into knowledge are important to us. They're so important that we're going to make them be at the big table. They're going to be there when the major decisions are made, when the major conversations are done and are had. They're going to be there and they're going to be part of that. And if that happens, then the rest of the cultural things can flow.
Okay, thank you. I think because we are running of the time, so we'll give a quick answer for the coming question, if you don't mind, Kendra and Bill. The old and renewal issue, the librarian and the library. Haider just asking about that. Now have to get both of them, the library or the librarian, more knowledge on digital humanities and knowledge management and other branches or topics to be transformed into knowledge center or knowledge management center. This issue between library, information center, and knowledge center, this what we call it, story that always coming to our mind. Please, Kendra.
It's a very difficult question to answer on a global scale because it varies from place to place. I can tell you that at Kent State, we have 5 master's degrees in the School of Information. one is an MLIS, which is the librarianship degree, and the other one is an MLIS for school libraries. So we have those two. We have a master's in user experience design, a master's degree in health informatics, and a master's degree in knowledge management. And the reason that we're split out is because of these new and emerging kinds of professions. And knowledge management is one of those. And so it's like Bill and I say, we're learning. I mean, we've been doing this now for quite a while, but we're still learning. There's a lot to learn about it. And we interface with a lot of business people. So having some business background is now built into our KM master's degree program. But they also take librarianship classes, taxonomy. So for example, it's an interdisciplinary field that many knowledge managers come from librarianship, because there's not very many knowledge management master's programs or bachelor's programs for that matter. But the KM programs can be found in library and information science, business, engineering, computer science, and public administration. Those are the ones that I've seen. I taught in knowledge management master's program at Sheffield, and the whole notion of knowledge management in the EU is very different than it is in the United States. People in Europe and the people that I've met in India, for example, really understand, and Africa also, understand the notion of knowledge management and what that means. Pardon my dog. And then we also have, sorry, Bill, I may end up letting you take this one over.
She needs to share her vote on this one. You're fine. We all have our own. Go ahead,
Yeah.
go ahead, no problem.
Bill, so I'll let you take over from there, because I don't know if he's going to stop. So.
Yeah. If you need to continue, you're fine.
Yes,
Yes, Bill.
yeah, I'll just finish up. KM, it's the relationships, as Kendra said, there's these different programs and different environments. And I think just what I would say is a librarian wanting to do or support their organization with regard to KM, keep in mind that your expertise as a librarian is focused more on explicit knowledge in a reported form, physical or digital primarily. Right? That's fine, and that's relevant to KM. But the other part of KM is knowledge that people hold in their minds, what's been called tacit knowledge. And that is not inherently part of what librarianship claims in terms of serving people. So it's just about, branching out and saying, okay, what I'm used to doing, I can continue to do, but I need to add this other broad area to what I do. And in that case, all is well. The thing to avoid would be to say, I'm a librarian, I can just do librarianship and call it KM. No, there's other aspects to KM. Conversely, if someone were to come into, say, a university as a KM consultant and say, well, we don't need a library. We do that, and we can just do your library work for you as a KM consultant or a KM firm. No, not exactly, because librarianship covers imaginative works. It covers literature, it covers art, it covers all kinds of recorded works of the imagination that KM's not interested in. Right? So they complement one another. And ideally what would be good in, say, in a university would be a team where you would have, say, maybe an outside consultant from KM, someone you've hired with KM expertise, and librarians and some others. And you might need to, draw in some other people. I mean, throughout the organization, key people that represent major constituencies in the organization for a KM team. And another project that Kendra and I are working on, we're realizing that if this project works out, it's very likely we're going to have to make recommendations to the organization that they need to hire some people. They may need to hire somebody to implement some technology. It would make more sense and be faster and better done if we don't do it, but we work with them to hire somebody that does do it. And we could take 2 years to do something that they could do in 6 months because they know how to do it. So you go out and you get a vendor. So you work cross purposes and cross units, but it's making sure you're covering the bases, and then if need be, go out throughout the organization, get the relevant people, and even outside the organization if need be, to get vendors and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to another question that away from librarian a little bit, but it's talking about how well repositories safely control the sharing of information that is confidential.
I saw that question. I hate to defer in this regard, but what I would say is that's an IT security, it's an information security issue. To have the levels of, maybe it's a password protection system that you need to get to the layers of information, because there are such things as business confidential or trade secrets or classified information, depending on what kind of organization you're in. It just depends. And so some of that stuff really shouldn't be shared across the organization, much less outside to other stakeholder groups, your clients or your customers or whatever. So I think that's really kind of and in this day and age, I would say it's a cybersecurity issue, as well. So that's an IT question, but the decision about what needs to be preserved and protected can be part of the KM strategy, but that's typically going to be a decision that's made at the senior management level.
Okay, Abir I think she's giving a statement more than a question. She said that maybe give us the learning organization is result of KM. I don't know if you need just to comment on that.
That's right. I think she's right. I think
yes.
I agree with that. Yes.
I agree with her as well. Okay, here we have, with today's catchy words like KM, digital humanities, and so on, the librarianship and libraries are being ignored. What do you suggest? I think we already talking more about this question, and Kendra and Bill already elaborate on it. What are aspects that should be considered for measuring KM success? I think it's very interesting and important question. Please.
Bill, you want to take a crack? I mean, I'm fine, but you can too.
And that can be, yeah.
It needs, I know, it needs a separated webinar.
You said earlier.
We tried it, yes.
Yeah, that really is. KM metrics it's its own thing. And, things like return on investment, increased profit. If you're in a for-profit setting, increased profit, increased margins, profit margins, return on investment, greater productivity, meaning more manufacturing production for a given amount of resources, greater efficiency, right? You can flip productivity around and look at it as efficiency. So these are metrics that you can use. If you're in a nonprofit setting, you're in an organization that's trying to make a social difference, you can track it out to the major metrics of the organization, the number of people served. How many people do you serve? Let's say you have a project with a class I'm teaching. They did their project on the food bank. They're a large-scale food bank for a region in one of our states. So, some of their metrics could be, how many people have you delivered food to? How did KM contribute to that delivery? You served 50,000 people a year before KM, 100,000 people a year after KM. And then you can work through how did KM contribute to that doubling of a service population. Within KM, you can track the number of technologies you have, the amount of knowledge discovery. Pretty obvious one is you can, to have metrics for the knowledge that you're dealing with. I mean, explicit knowledge can be things like numbers of documents and so forth. Tacit knowledge can be numbers of experts that you have in your organization. Do you have 100 different areas of expertise that people have tacit knowledge in, and 300 experts across those 100 areas? That can be a very useful thing to track. So you can track KM internally to great benefit, but you can also track it, if you will, externally. What is it doing for the organization and in the organization's larger environment? So you can do it. It's not either or, it's both and. You can do both. But it's a great question. I mean, how do you measure this? It's like any KM is a support process. sort of, it's analogous in some ways, for example, to quality management or regulatory compliance, or in some organizations, human resources is thought of this way, and some it's not. But it's often not considered a core process, like a manufacturing or something like that. But it's a secondary, it's a support process. But the challenge is, yeah, how does that support process contribute to the main processes and ultimately the organization? What metrics do you want to use? Keeping in mind that those metrics are going to be, that influence is often moderated through its effect on other processes. So it's not that KM directly, for example, feeds 15,000 more people, but KM supports and contributes to processes that we're able to go from feeding 50,000 people in a year to 100,000 people in a year.
Yeah.
And so it's a mediating variable challenge that you have to think through of how are you going to measure it? But it's a valid question. And I will say that I think our experience is that KM its culture is it's open to this. It's open to metrics and how to measure and so forth. Kendra?
I was just going to add the qualitative variables to that as well, is that sometimes it's not just things that you measure in terms of numbers. It's also the stories that people tell, the impact that your organization is having on
observation
lives. That it depends. The answer is, I think that it really depends on what the organization is trying to accomplish. If the organization, for example, is trying to improve equality in the world, I'm making this up, but if that's what they're trying to do, then stories are very powerful tools and will be much more resonant with the impact on the organization than will the numbers of people who are subscribed to your Facebook page. Although that doesn't hurt, and oftentimes you want to triangulate that data. But in general, I think it's important to consider both the quantitative measures as well as the qualitative data that you can pull together.
Okay. Thank you for your both. We got a question here. It's over the WhatsApp because we open it for different data. It's from Professor Amal Waji, and she asking about the perfect time that the organization starts to capture its expert knowledge. What is the perfect time for that? At the beginning or at the end, or before they're leaving?
You know, this is a question that we've been, and Bill, I don't even know if you and I have had this conversation yet, but in one of our projects, I think I did tell you this, it dawned on me that this is a project that is in the planning stage. This project could develop into something in a major way. This could become a major project for a regional part of the country. And it's got wonderful people working on it, but it has yet to establish operational practices, and it does not yet have a fully developed strategic plan. At this point, we're still building the expert database, if you will, we're building this in SharePoint of who's got what expertise, because the team that originally started as just a handful of people is now gradually expanding. And while right now we all know who to call for what thing, if this thing takes off as we expect it to, as soon as we get funding, which I think is right around the corner, then we're going to need that expertise directory right now. And so I don't think it's ever too early to start collecting your expertise and knowing who's got what. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Perfect.
I agree.
Yeah. You need to elaborate more. Yes, Bill, please. We need to elaborate more to add something.
Yeah, I would say grow as sooner rather than later. Yeah, sooner rather than later. If an organization already, as Kendra said, we're working on a project where the organization is coming together ever so slowly. It doesn't formally exist yet. We're coming up to that. But if your organization is already formally existing and operating, then go ahead and start to engage with this, start to think about what expertise do you have? Who has it? And begin to become more consciously aware of that, to document that. And it's actually something that I think once you do it, you'll be surprised what you already have, either within the organization or very easily accessible outside the organization. So it'll be a pleasant surprise. So it's worth going ahead and starting sooner rather than later.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time. So the one last question we can just answer it. Dini, just can you give some examples of the best practices on marketing and promoting knowledge management within the organization? We just can give hits on these just tools or approaches for marketing knowledge management within the organization. We can wrap up after this question, please.
To me, again, having senior management to make an announcement is the first and foremost important thing to kick it off. But I think that it's also something that needs to filter through the organization in a variety of different ways that we've kind of touched on today, like setting up the communities of practice, structuring your codified knowledge as much as you can to make it already available as broadly as you can, and then continue to explain across, you could do that like the Shell company did, the lunch and learns and that sort of stuff. It's a self-motivating, self-propelling process that once you get it started and you can keep it going, then you're in good shape. But the having the structures in place as much as you can to support that with senior management support, and then utilizing the existing communication structures and expanding those for KM, helping facilitate training sessions on how to use those explicit knowledge systems, how we intend to capture. Somebody said organizations that have KM strategies have a list of key performance indicators and of course responsibilities for those their achievement. Thank you for that. That's brilliant.
Great. Yes.
That is exactly the answer to this question, which is you have to identify what those things are, how you're going to reach each of those communities that you need to engage in the KM process, and have your senior management support that and those structures in place. That's right. So you have to identify what those things are for your individual organization for it to be effective. Yeah.
Thank you. Bell, you need to add more things, elaborate more on this.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. One thing we've learned too from people that have done this a lot is that KM needs to go in, and particularly if the organization is already ongoing, already existing, as soon as you can, fairly rapidly, have some successes. It can be simple successes, but just go ahead and focus on some things where you can have some success. And that convinces people of the value. And then you go on to maybe a little bit of a bigger success and a bigger success and so forth. So you're balancing the immediate and the eventual. Immediately, you're doing some small worthwhile things, you're getting some success. Eventually, you have this eventual vision, and you're building towards that. And then, so in addition to having the excellent strategic or the excellent senior management support, you're having success, and that should be somewhere in the organization, probably below the senior management level, be it the tactical or operational level, so that people can see, oh, this is making a difference. And then as things go well and you have more successes, if you will, word gets around in the organization. So, and that acts as marketing. That's essentially the equivalent of word of mouth marketing. And it's often the case that, word of mouth marketing is the best. People tell people that something's great, so they try it and they enjoy it, and then they tell their friends and so forth. And so it's the equivalent of that.
Thank you so much, and I do appreciate that this very interesting engagement with the whole attendees, and I always say that the main indicator for the success of any webinar is raising more questions than answering the questions, and that's what happened. Also, the flying time of the webinar is one of the indicators. So both of these two aspects we found it in this webinar. We appreciate it to have Kendra and Bell. Both of you doctors are very, very honored to have you. So thank you so much, and we for sure will have you again on board. Based on many of attendees just asking for another webinar, so for sure we will be glad to have you again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the valuable knowledge you share. And thank you for showing your puppy this with us. It's very nice to have her with us. So it's so nice, yeah. Appreciate it so much, and thank you again. Thank you for all the attendees, and I am confirming that you will receive a certificate just signed by all of the panelists, and the presentation will be uploaded to Naseej Academy website and as well on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. And till we meet again in another webinar. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Shukran.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Excellent work. Assalamu alaikum.